The tourists who pay for my tour see the egrets taking flight, their white wings like strokes of paint against a canvas of green and brown. They see the alligators, ancient and unmoving as sunken logs, their eyes just above the waterline. They hear my practiced stories about Jean Lafitte's pirates and the voodoo queens of the Honey Island swamp. What they don't see are the small, wet handprints that sometimes appear on the hull after dark. What they don't know is that my job isn't just to show them the bayou, it's to make sure the bayou doesn't take them. And tonight I almost failed. My name is Leo. For the last 6 years I've captained the Cypress Queen, a flat-bottomed tour boat that's seen better decades. Her paint is peeling, her engine coughs to life like an old man on a cold morning, and she lists just enough to the port side to make first-timers nervous. But she's mine. Or at least, mine to run. The bayou is in my blood, a sluggish, muddy inheritance passed down through generations of fishermen and trappers who knew this labyrinth of waterways better than their own backyards. For me, it's just a job, a way to trade the predictable drone of an office for the predictable drone of cicadas and mosquitoes. I lead 2 tours a day, one in the late morning, one in the afternoon. I tell the same jokes, point out the same nests, and warn tourists not to trail their hands in the murky water. It's a simple, monotonous life, and I've grown to appreciate the quiet rhythm of it. I inherited the Cypress Queen, and her root not from family, but from a man named Beau Gallois. Beau was a local legend, a Cajun whose family had been in these parts since the French first settled them. He had skin like tanned leather, and eyes the color of the bayou itself. He spoke in a thick, syrupy accent, and he knew stories about this swamp that were never written down. He disappeared 3 years before I took over. One day he just vanished. The Coast Guard found the Cypress Queen idling in a secluded channel, a half-empty thermos of coffee still warm on the console. No sign of struggle, no sign of Beau. The official story was that he'd had a heart attack and fallen overboard, a tragic but plausible end for a man his age. The old-timers in town would just shake their heads and mutter, "The bayou takes what it wants." When Beau's estranged daughter from up north came down to settle his affairs, she just wanted to get rid of everything. She sold me the boat and the business license for a price that felt more like a plea than a negotiation. Inside a rusted lockbox in the boat's small cabin, I found the keys, the title, and a yellowed laminated card. On it, typed on an old typewriter, was a short list under the heading, "Rules for after sundown. Never kill the main engine after the sun has set. Even at anchor, let it idle. Never answer a voice that calls your name from the banks, no matter who it sounds like. If the boat's lights begin to flicker, return to the dock immediately. Do not stop for anything." I remember laughing the first time I read it. It felt like a part of the local color, a bit of theatrical superstition Beau might have used to spook tourists. Still, out of a strange sense of respect for the man who had given me this new life, I'd always followed them. The few times I was caught on the water a little after dusk, I kept the engine running. I never heard any voices. The lights, old as they were, had never flickered. The rules were a ghost, a harmless echo of an old man's eccentricities. I followed them not because I believed in them, but because it was easier than not to. It was a simple ritual, and rituals brought comfort in the vast, lonely expanse of the swamp. That comfort shattered last night. It started with a bachelor party from New Orleans, a group of 10 guys already half drunk by the time they stepped onto the dock for the last tour of the day. They were loud, obnoxious, and flashing wads of cash. Their leader, a broad-shouldered finance bro named Chad, pulled me aside. He wanted a real experience. He'd heard the swamp was haunted and he and his buddies wanted a private night tour. They'd pay triple my usual rate. I should have said no. Every instinct I had screamed it. I never did night tours. The insurance didn't cover it for one, and navigating these channels in the dark is a fool's game even if you know them. But my rent was late, and the Cypress Queen needed a new water pump. The thick stack of $100 bills Chad waved in my face was a powerful argument against my better judgment. "Just an hour after sunset," he'd slurred, clapping me on the shoulder. "Give us a few ghost stories. We'll make it worth your while." Against my own rules, against the memory of Beau, I agreed. The money was just too much to refuse. The first part of the extended tour was normal enough. I gave them the standard spiel, they cracked open more beers, and the bayou offered up its usual daytime beauty. But as the sun began its slow descent, the atmosphere shifted. The light turned golden, then a deep, bruised purple. The air grew thick and heavy. The symphony of the day, the birds, the frogs, the insects, faded into a tense silence, the kind that precedes a storm. Then, the night sounds began. The hunting calls of owls, the deep, guttural bellow of a bull-gator somewhere in the darkness, and the incessant, high-pitched whine of mosquitoes gathering in clouds around the boat. The familiar landscape became an alien world of menacing shapes. The gnarled branches of cypress trees, draped in Spanish moss, looked like skeletal arms reaching out from the black water. I took them deep into a section of the swamp known as the Devil's Elbow, a place Bo had told me to avoid. I'd always assumed it was because of the treacherous shallow spots, but as I cut the engine back, not off, never off, the oppressive silence in that channel was different. It felt ancient and watchful. "All right, fellas," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud. "They say this part of the swamp is home to the feux follets, ghost lights that lead travelers astray." I launched into one of Bo's old stories, hamming it up for the drunken crowd. It was halfway through the tale when I heard it. Liu. It was faint, a high, thin sound, like a child's whisper carried on the breeze. It seemed to come from the dense, impenetrable wall of cypress and mangrove to our starboard side. I stopped talking mid-sentence. My blood ran cold. "You guys hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Chad laughed. "Hear what, man? An old ghost calling your name?" His friends snickered. They hadn't heard a thing. I shook my head, my heart thumping against my ribs. Nothing, just the wind. But it wasn't the wind. The air was perfectly still, so humid you could almost drink it. I tried to continue my story, but the words felt hollow in my mouth. I kept glancing towards the dark shoreline, my eyes straining to see something, anything. I was remembering the second rule: never answer a voice that calls your name from the banks. I decided to wrap it up. The thrill was gone, replaced by a raw, primal fear that I couldn't explain. "Okay, folks, show's over for tonight. Let's head back before the real monsters come out," I announced, forcing a chuckle. I turned the wheel and began to push the throttle forward. That's when it happened. The string of cheap yellow bug lights I'd wrapped around the boat's canopy flickered once, then twice. Then they began to strobe in a frantic, sickening rhythm, plunging us into near darkness for a second before flashing back on. The tourists groaned, thinking it was a power issue. But I was staring at the lights, paralyzed. My mind was screaming the third rule at me: if the boat's lights begin to flicker, return to the dock immediately. Panic, pure and undiluted, seized me. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a faulty wire. This was a signal, a warning. "Generators on the fritz," I yelled over the engine's roar, which I'd pushed to full throttle. "We gotta go, now." The ride back was a blur. I didn't take the wide, safe channels. I cut through narrow passages, the hull scraping against submerged logs, driven by a terror I hadn't felt since I was a child, afraid of the dark. The tourists were shouting, half in excitement, half in anger, but I ignored them. My knuckles were white on the wheel, my eyes fixed on the distant glow of the town lights, a beacon of safety in a world that had suddenly become hostile and unknowable. When we finally reached the dock, the harsh, steady glare of the sodium lamps felt like a divine blessing. I cut the engine back to an idle, my hands shaking so badly I could barely tie the boat off. The bachelor party stumbled onto the dock, complaining about the shortened tour but too drunk to really care. Chad slapped another $100 bill into my hand. "Good scare, man, real authentic." I just nodded, unable to speak. I stood on the deck of the Cypress Queen for a long time after they left, the silence of the now empty dock ringing in my ears. I felt like a fool. I had let a combination of stress, superstition, and the eerie night get the better of me. A voice in the wind, a faulty wire. It was nothing. As I began my final checks, coiling ropes and clearing away empty beer cans, my hand brushed against the side of the hull near the stern. It felt slick, wet. That was strange. The water had been calm. No spray had come over the side. I crouched down, squinting under the garish orange light of the dock. And then I saw them. Starting just above the dark, oily waterline and leading up the peeling paint of the hull was a series of handprints. They were small, no bigger than a child's. They were perfectly formed in the thin layer of algae and grime, the dark marks of 5 tiny fingers and a small palm, repeated over and over. They formed a neat little ladder, as if someone, or something, had been trying to climb aboard while we were sitting in the silent darkness of the Devil's Elbow. I've lived on this water my whole life. I thought I knew its secrets, its dangers, and its tricks, but this was something new, something terribly wrong. The rules weren't just an old man's superstitions, they were a warning, and I had no idea what I had just invited into my life. If you want to find out what those handprints mean, and what other secrets Beau Gallois left behind for me to find, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. The story only gets darker from here. Sleep did not come that night. It couldn't find purchase in a mind consumed by the image of those small, dark handprints against the white hull of the Cypress Queen. I must have scrubbed that spot for a full hour after the tourists left, the bristles of the deck brush scraping furiously, as if I could physically erase the event from reality. But the memory was more stubborn than the grime. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. A tiny ladder leading from the black, unknowable depths. I kept telling myself there was a logical explanation, a prank, a reflection in the water that my panicked mind had twisted into something sinister. Perhaps one of the drunken bachelor party members had a kid who'd been on the dock earlier. It was a flimsy, pathetic collection of rationalizations, and the part of me that knew the swamp, the deep, instinctual part, rejected them all. The bayou doesn't play pranks. It sets traps. The following morning, I operated on a mixture of caffeine and sheer adrenaline. The sun felt different. The familiar calls of the marsh birds sounded less like a greeting and more like an alarm. During my morning tour, a young mother pointed to a turtle sunning itself on a log, and her little boy, no older than 5, clapped his hands in delight. The sight sent a jolt of ice through my veins. His hands were the same size. I found myself staring, my pre-rehearsed speech about alligator nesting habits dying on my lips, until the mother gave me a strange, concerned look. I quickly turned away, my face flushed with a mixture of shame and a crawling electric dread. I was becoming unhinged. This single, unexplainable event was poisoning my perception of the world. That afternoon, between tours, I knew I couldn't go on like this. The mystery wasn't going to solve itself. It was going to fester. My first thought was Beau. The boat, the rules, this entire mess had started with him. His official story, a heart attack, a clumsy fall overboard, had always felt too neat, too simple for a man who moved through the swamp with the quiet confidence of a native creature. I retreated to the small, stifling cabin of the Cypress Queen, the air thick with the smell of old vinyl and gasoline. I pulled out my phone, my fingers slick with sweat, and started digging. I searched for old news reports about his disappearance. Most were brief syndicated articles from regional papers. Local tour operator presumed drowned. Search called off for missing Cajun guide. But then I found it. A longer piece from the St. Tammany Parish Chronicle, a local paper known for its more in-depth reporting. The article quoted the Coast Guard officer who led the search. He noted the strangeness of the scene. The Cypress Queen wasn't damaged. It hadn't run aground. It was just idling in the middle of a wide, calm channel, miles from any hazardous spots. The officer was quoted as saying, "It looked like the operator just stood up and walked away." But the most chilling detail was in the final paragraph. A local fisherman, an old friend of Beau's named Jacques Thibodeau, had been the one to find the boat. He told the reporter that the engine was running smoothly, but every single light on the vessel was blinking on and off in a slow, steady rhythm, like a beacon or a warning. My blood turned to ice. Rule number 3, if the boat's lights begin to flicker, return to the dock immediately. Had Beau's lights started flickering? Is that why he had stopped? Did he get out to check something? The questions multiplied, each one darker than the last. He hadn't accidentally fallen, he had been lured. Fueled by this terrifying confirmation, my search became a frenzy. Beau hadn't left a will, but he must have left something else. A clue, a journal, anything. The boat was his entire world. If the answer was anywhere, it was here. I started tearing the small cabin apart, I checked every storage locker, every compartment, under the worn-out bunk and behind the rusty first aid kit. Nothing. Just old life vests, greasy rags, and a few forgotten fishing lures. Frustration and despair began to set in. Was I just chasing shadows, driven mad by a single hallucination? I slumped onto the captain's chair, the cracked vinyl groaning under my weight. My eyes scanned the console, a place I saw every single day, and for the first time I noticed something I'd always overlooked. The wooden paneling beneath the steering column was slightly discolored in one spot, a shade darker than the rest. It wasn't a stain, it looked more like a seam. My heart hammered against my ribs. I wedged my fingers into the tiny gap and pulled. At first it wouldn't budge, but then, with a groan of old, swollen wood, a small rectangular section came loose. It wasn't a panel, it was a cleverly disguised drawer. And inside, nestled in the dark, dusty space, was a single object, a thick, leather-bound logbook, its cover stained with mildew and time. Its pages were filled with Beau's tight, spidery handwriting. It wasn't an official ship's log, it was a private journal, a record of his secrets. I opened it, my hands trembling. The early entries were exactly what you'd expect. Notes on weather patterns, fuel consumption, interesting wildlife sightings. Saw a bald eagle near the old cypress grove today. The tourists from Ohio loved it. Engines making a rattling noise again. Need to check the housing. It was mundane. It was normal. But as I flipped further, the tone began to shift. The entries became shorter, more erratic. The handwriting grew frantic. October 12th. Heard it again tonight. The call, closer this time. Had to lie to the passengers, said it was a fox. They didn't believe me, I can see it in their eyes. They think I'm a crazy old coot. October 19th. The lights flickered near the Devil's Elbow. Got back to the dock so fast I nearly swamped a fishing skiff. Old Jacques saw my face. He knows. He just looked down and shook his head. No one will talk about it. They just know. Then came the entries that made my breath catch in my throat. He began documenting new rules, as if discovering them through brutal trial and error. November 3rd. A gift today. A beautiful, perfectly preserved conch shell sitting on the engine cover after I made a stop. Shimmered like a pearl. I almost picked it up. A voice in my head, a whisper like dry leaves, told me it was for me. I remembered what my grandpère used to say, "The swamp gives nothing for free." I backed away from it, pushed it into the water with an oar. The cold that followed, it wasn't natural. It felt like hate. I'm adding a new rule. Rule 4. Never retrieve what the water offers you. It isn't a gift, it's bait. And then, the entry that chilled me to the bone. November 10th. Saw the little boat today. First time this season, just drifting out of the fog. So small, so innocent. A child's toy hand-carved from cypress wood. It floated towards me, a direct path. I wanted to grab it. I wanted to take it home, fix its tiny broken mast. But there was something wrong with it. The water around it was dead. No insects, no ripples, just a perfect, silent circle. It knows what we desire. It knows our kindness is our weakness. I turned the bow and sped away. My heart feels like a cold stone in my chest. Rule 5. Ignore the toy boat. Ignore it, or you'll follow it. The final entry was dated the day before he disappeared. The handwriting was barely legible, a chaotic scrawl across the page. It's in my head now. It's not just in the water. I hear her, the mother, crying for her boy. I hear him too. He just wants to play. They promise peace. They promise an end to the loneliness. It's a lie. It's a hook. But I am so tired. The lights won't stop flickering. I slammed the book shut, my whole body shaking. This was real. This was a legacy of terror, passed down from one captain to the next. Beau hadn't just sold me a boat. He had passed on a curse, a guardianship he could no longer bear. I felt a surge of anger, followed by a wave of profound, soul-crushing fear. I was no longer just a tour guide. I was a watchman on the edge of an abyss. For the next week, I lived in a state of hypervigilance. Every tour was an exercise in controlled terror. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking shape. Every whisper of the wind against the canopy sounded like my name. I became obsessed with the rules, Beau's 5 commandments, repeating them in my head like a prayer. I even tried talking to some of the other old-timers down at the marina, the men who had known Beau for decades. I brought him up casually, asking if he'd ever mentioned anything strange about the bayou. The reaction was always the same. Their faces would shudder, their eyes would dart away. Jacques Thibodeau, the man who'd found Beau's boat, simply put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Some waters are best left undisturbed, son. You just run your tours and go home." It was a conspiracy of silence, an entire community built around a shared, unspoken dread. They wouldn't help me. I was completely, utterly alone in this. The test came on a Tuesday. It was a beautiful, clear afternoon, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. I had a small, quiet group on board, a family of 4 from Germany. The water was like glass. It was the kind of perfect day that made you forget that the swamp had any teeth. We were gliding through a narrow, moss-draped channel when I saw it. Drifting slowly out from behind a thicket of reeds, there it was. A small, hand-carved toy boat. It was exactly as Beau had described it, made of dark, weathered cypress wood, with a tiny, splintered mast. It was moving with a purpose that defied the gentle current, making a slow, deliberate beeline for the Cypress Queen. The German father pointed at it. "Oh, look, a toy. Perhaps a child has lost it." The little girl beside him gasped with delight. "Can we get it, Papa?" Every muscle in my body went rigid. Beau's final rule screamed in my mind, "Ignore the toy boat." My rational brain was at war with the primal terror flooding my system. It was just a piece of wood, a lost toy. Grabbing it would make a little girl's day. Ignoring it would be strange, callous even. But when I looked at it, really looked at it, I saw what Beau had seen. The water around it was unnaturally still. The dragonflies that usually danced on the surface were absent. A palpable cold seemed to emanate from it, a pocket of winter in the humid summer air. It felt ancient, hungry, and deeply, deeply wrong. I forced a tight smile. "Ah, no. We must leave that one be. It's for the swamp spirits. A local tradition. Bad luck to touch it." The father gave me a curious look, but thankfully accepted the explanation, distracting his daughter by pointing out a heron on the bank. I pushed the throttle forward, my eyes locked on the toy boat as we passed. As we moved away, I felt a wave of something I can only describe as malevolent disappointment wash over me. It was a feeling, and psychic pressure, that had no physical source, yet it was as real as the sweat on my brow. I had passed the test. I had followed the rule. For a moment, a sliver of relief pierced through the fear. Maybe that was it. Maybe I could manage this. That relief was a fragile, stupid thing. That evening, I went home to my small rented house a few miles from the docks, determined to have a normal night. I'd cook a real meal, watch a movie, drink a beer. I would force normalcy back into my life. I was just finishing washing the dishes when I heard a sound from the back of the house, a soft, rhythmic dripping. It wasn't the familiar leaky faucet in the kitchen. This was a heavier, more persistent sound. It was coming from the bathroom. I dried my hands, my heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I walked down the short hallway, the floorboards creaking under my feet. The bathroom door was slightly ajar. The dripping was louder now. Plink, plonk, plink. I pushed the door open, and the world fell out from under me. The air was cold and thick with the unmistakable earthy smell of swamp mud and decaying vegetation. The white-tiled floor was covered in a film of brackish brown water. And the bathtub. The bathtub was filled to the absolute brim with the same opaque black water from the bayou. It was as if someone had scooped a piece of the devil's elbow and teleported it into my home, my sanctuary. But that wasn't the worst part. Floating in the dead center of the tub, perfectly still under the flickering fluorescent light, was the hand-carved toy boat. Its splintered mast pointed directly at my chest. It was no longer a thing I had left behind in the swamp. It had followed me. The rules didn't keep it away. They had only told it where I lived. The barrier was broken. The water had offered me a gift, and by refusing it, I had only invited it in. For a long moment, I could do nothing but stand in the doorway of my own bathroom. a stranger in a desecrated space. My mind refused to process the scene, attempting to file it under nightmare or hallucination. But the cold emanating from the room was real, a damp, sepulchral chill that clung to my skin and smelled of rot and river mud. The toy boat sat motionless in the center of the black water, a king on its foul throne. It wasn't just a piece of wood, it was an effigy, a declaration of presence. The barrier I had so carefully, so unknowingly, maintained between my life and the bayou's deeper, darker life had not just been breached, it had been annihilated. The swamp was in my house. My first coherent thought was not one of fear, but of a strange, horrifying practicality. I had to get it out. I couldn't call a plumber. I couldn't ask a neighbor for help. This was my contamination, my secret shame. To expose it would be to admit my own insanity. I grabbed a bucket from the laundry closet, my movements stiff and robotic. I knelt on the wet tiles, the unnatural cold of the water seeping through the knees of my jeans. I plunged the bucket into the tub. The water was shockingly, painfully cold. Far colder than the bayou itself, and it was thick, resisting the bucket like sludge. As I hauled it out, mud and black stringy weeds dripped from the bottom, staining the floor. One bucket at a time, I began the Herculean task of emptying my bathtub of the abyss it contained. Each trip to dump the foul water in the backyard was a walk of shame, a retreat from the invading force. With every bucketful, the toy boat lowered, until it finally came to rest on the stained, muddy bottom of the tub. I stared at it, my breath held tight in my chest. I had to touch it. I had to remove it. Wrapping my hand in a towel, as if that could offer some meager protection, I reached in and grasped the small wooden hull. The cold it radiated was immediate and intense, a dead, absolute cold that seemed to suck the warmth directly from my bones. It felt ancient, saturated not just with water, but with sorrow and a chilling, patient malevolence. I lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked, weighted with a significance my mind couldn't grasp. I didn't dare throw it away. Beau's journal had taught me that much. Disrespecting their offerings, their symbols, was a mistake. This thing had to be returned. I didn't wait for morning. I placed the toy boat in a cardboard box, set it on the passenger seat of my truck, and drove back to the marina under a moonless, starless sky. The journey felt surreal. The familiar roads were transformed into menacing tunnels of darkness. I felt watched, not by human eyes, but by something far older that saw without them. I launched the Cypress Queen into the black, silent water. Guided only by the boat's small spotlight and my own muscle memory, I navigated back to the exact spot where the toy had first appeared. The air was heavy, the silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. I cut the engine to an idle, Rule 1, a frantic prayer in my mind, and took the toy boat from its box. For a moment, I held it over the water. "This is yours," I whispered, my voice a pathetic tremor in the immense silence. "I don't want it." I placed it gently on the surface. It didn't drift. It turned, its tiny bow pointing away from me, and moved purposefully back towards the dark reeds, disappearing into the shadows like a phantom. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I slammed the throttle forward and fled back to the perceived safety of the dock, the roar of the engine a desperate attempt to drown out the silence that now terrified me more than any sound. But the swamp, once invited in, does not easily leave. The smell of mud and decay lingered in my house for days, a constant nauseating reminder, no matter how much bleach I used. And that's when the new phase of torment began. It started with whispers, faint, sibilant sounds from the corners of rooms, like the rustle of dry leaves or the skittering of unseen insects just at the edge of my hearing. I would whip my head around to find nothing. I would pause the television, straining to listen only for the sound to vanish, leaving me in a state of ringing silence and frantic paranoia. Then, the whispers became more personal. They weren't just noises anymore. They were fragments of my own forgotten past. Lying in bed, I'd hear the faint, tinny melody of an ice cream truck that used to drive down my street when I was 7 years old. While making coffee, I'd hear the soft, chiding voice of my third-grade teacher, a woman I hadn't thought of in 20 years, murmuring a phrase she used to say, "Leo, you have your head in the clouds again." It was psychological warfare of the most insidious kind. It was using my own memories as a weapon, proving it had access to the most private, sealed-off chambers of my mind. It was trying to convince me that my own head was no longer a safe place to be. My life began to unravel. I was barely sleeping, jolted awake by sounds that may or may not have been real. I lost weight. Dark, bruised circles formed under my eyes. On my tours, I was distracted and irritable. I would forget the names of the birds I was pointing to. I'd stare out into the endless green searching for something, and my passengers would exchange worried glances. I was becoming the crazy old coot Beau had written about. I was alone, trapped on a sinking island of my own sanity, and the water was rising. The entity, the presence, whatever it was, had been testing me, probing my defenses, and then it found my greatest vulnerability. It found Anna. My wife, Anna, died 4 years ago. A car accident on a rain-slicked highway. It was sudden, senseless, and it had hollowed me out completely. She was the anchor of my life, and without her I had been adrift, which is what led me to the quiet solitude of the bayou in the first place. Her memory was a sacred, painful place I kept locked away. And the thing in my house found the key. It started one evening as I was staring blankly at the TV. I heard her humming. It was a specific, slightly off-key rendition of a song she used to hum while she was cooking. The sound was so clear, so perfectly her, that for a heart-stopping second I forgot she was gone. I turned, a joyful, idiotic smile forming on my face, expecting to see her in the kitchen doorway. The doorway was empty. The humming stopped, and the silence that rushed back in was filled with an agony so profound it brought me to my knees. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a desecration of my most precious memories. From then on, Anna was its favorite tool. It used her voice to call my name from empty rooms, her tone shifting from loving and gentle to disappointed and accusatory. "Leo, why did you let me go?" It would whisper from my closet at night. "You should have been with me, Leo." I would shout back at the walls, my voice raw with grief and rage, telling it to leave her alone, to leave me alone. I was arguing with a ghost, a parasite that was feeding on my sorrow. I knew, logically, that it wasn't her. It was a mimic, a cruel, intelligent echo. But in the dark, lonely hours of the night, logic is a fragile shield against the weapons of the heart. Desperation is a powerful catalyst. I knew I was breaking. Soon, there would be nothing left of me to break. My only hope, my only source of information, was back on the Cypress Queen. I had to go back to Beau's journal. I had read the rules, but I must have missed something more. There had to be an answer, a weakness, a way to fight back, not just endure. One afternoon, I cancelled my last tour, telling the disappointed tourists that the engine was faulty. I locked myself in the boat's cabin, the journal open on the small table. I didn't just read it this time. I dissected it. I analyzed every word, every frantic pen stroke. I was looking for patterns, for anything that didn't fit. Most of it was just a chronicle of his descent into fear, but in the last few pages, I found something. Amidst the scrawled fears and repeated rules, there were sketches, hasty, barely coherent drawings of the boat's layout. He had circled a specific spot on the port side of the deck, near the stern. Beside the circle, he had written a single cryptic phrase, "Le fardeau du passeur," the ferryman's burden. The spot he had circled was just a plain section of the wooden deck, worn smooth by years of foot traffic. I'd walked over it 1,000 times, but now, examining it closely, I saw that the heads of the screws holding that particular plank down were newer, less rusted than the others. My heart pounded. With the tools from my kit, I began to work on them, my hands clumsy with anticipation. The screws were tight, but they finally gave way with a screech of tortured metal. I lifted the plank. Underneath, set into a small carved-out hollow in the boat's frame, was an object wrapped in oilcloth. My fingers trembled as I unwrapped it. It was a locket, small, silver, and tarnished black, with age and moisture. It felt cold to the touch, imbued with the same deep, unnatural chill as the toy boat. It was a simple oval design, with delicate engravings of vines and flowers on its surface. With a thumbnail, I pried it open. Inside were 2 tiny sepia-toned photographs, protected by thin, yellowed celluloid. On the left was the portrait of a young woman, her hair pulled back in a style from a century ago. Her expression was serious, but her eyes held a deep sadness. On the right was a picture of a little boy, no older than 5 or 6, dressed in a formal-looking sailor suit. He wasn't smiling. He was staring directly at the camera with an unnervingly solemn gaze. The ferryman's burden. These were my ghosts. This was the mother and her son. I snapped the locket shut, the click echoing in the silent cabin. Holding it felt like holding a key, but I had no idea what lock it opened. Was this the source of the curse? Was I supposed to destroy it? Return it to the water? 1,000 questions flooded my mind, each one more desperate than the last. As I stood there, lost in a maelstrom of fear and confusion, a sound cut through the silence. It was my phone, buzzing on the console where I'd left it. I glanced at the screen. The display read, "Unknown number." Normally I would have ignored it. But in that moment, instinct took over. A cold, dreadful certainty told me who or what was calling. My hand moved as if of its own accord. I swiped to answer and raised the phone to my ear. For a few seconds there was only silence, a strange, hollow static that sounded like rushing water heard from a great distance. Then a voice spoke, and the world stopped turning. "Leo." It was Anna's voice. Not a whisper from a dark corner, not a fragmented memory. It was her voice, clear and perfect, filled with the warmth and love I thought I would never hear again. It was so real that a sob caught in my throat. "Anna," I breathed, my resolve crumbling into dust. "I miss you, honey," the voice said. And it was her. It was the exact gentle cadence of her speech. A tear rolled down my cheek. "It's so lonely here. But I found something. A new friend. He's been waiting for a long time." A cold dread began to seep back in, warring with the impossible hope her voice had created. "Anna, where are you? What are you talking about?" Her voice changed then. The warmth bled out of it, replaced by a flat, hollow echo. "He just wants to play, Leo. His mother is so sad. She lost him in the dark water. You have the locket. You can bring it back to them." And then she said the words that would be burned into my mind forever. "We're waiting for you. Come back to the water." The line didn't go dead. Her voice dissolved, melting into a new sound. It was the high, clear sound of a child's laughter, but the laughter itself began to distort, bubbling and warping, until it was no longer human. It became the sound of water, of drowning, of air struggling to escape from submerged lungs. It was a gurgling, watery static that filled my ear before the call finally, abruptly, ended. I stood there, phone clutched in my white-knuckled hand, the silver locket cold against my other palm. The invitation had been sent. The lines between the living and the dead, my past and their present, had been erased. It was no longer just haunting my house. It was wearing the face of my dead wife, and it was calling me home. The gurgling static of that phone call echoed in my head for hours, a phantom sound that refused to fade. It was a violation far deeper than the water in my tub or the whispers in my walls. This entity had worn the voice of my wife, puppeteering my most sacred memories with a sickening, casual cruelty. The grief it had reawakened was a raw, physical ache, but beneath it, something new was beginning to crystallize, a cold, hard shard of anger. The fear hadn't vanished, far from it, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was clarifying. I was not just a victim of some random, malevolent force. I was being targeted, manipulated, and the locket I held in my hand, its silver cool against my clammy skin, was no longer just a cursed object. It was a clue. It was the starting point of a history I desperately needed to understand if I had any hope of surviving. The next morning I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove into St. Tammany Parish to the Old Town Archives. It was a quiet, dusty building that smelled of decaying paper and furniture polish, a mausoleum of forgotten stories. I approached the head archivist, a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Genevieve Dubois, who peered at me over her spectacles as if I were a particularly complex and uninteresting species of insect. My request was vague and probably sounded insane. I was looking for information on old shipwrecks or boating accidents in the Honey Island swamp area. specifically anything involving a woman and a young boy, possibly from the late 19th or early 20th century. She listened with a practiced patience, tapping a long manicured finger on her desk. When I finished, she gave a slow, deliberate sigh. "The bayou has a long memory, and it doesn't keep very good records," she said, her voice dry as old parchment. "Hundreds of people have been lost to that water over the centuries. Trappers, fishermen, loggers, entire families." She could see the desperation in my eyes, though, and perhaps a flicker of pity softened her professional austerity. She led me to a towering shelf of thick, leather-bound ledgers containing parish death records and pointed me toward a collection of microfiche reels holding digitized copies of the old St. Tammany Chronicle. "If it was a tragedy of any note," she said, her voice softening slightly, "it will be in one of these. Godspeed." For hours, I scrolled through endless reels of microfilm, the hypnotic whir of the machine mixing with the frantic pounding of my heart. I scanned headlines about crop yields, church socials, and political squabbles, my eyes aching from the strain. I was drowning in a sea of irrelevant history, my hope beginning to fray. Just as I was about to give up, a small headline from an October 1927 issue caught my eye. "Local ferry capsizes in sudden squall. Several feared lost." My breath hitched. I zoomed in, my hands shaking as I adjusted the focus. The article described a small steam-powered ferry, the St. Rosalie, which ran a regular route across the widest part of the Sound, connecting two small, now-vanished logging communities. On a calm autumn afternoon, a freak storm, a waterspout of terrifying force, had descended upon the ferry, overturning it in moments. There were 10 souls on board. The reporter listed the names of the 5 known survivors who had clung to the wreckage until they were rescued by local fishermen. Then came the list of the missing, presumed drowned. My eyes scanned the names, and there they were, the final 2 on the list: Mrs. Elodie Broussard and her son, Julien Broussard, age 6. My blood ran cold. The names resonated with an awful, immediate truth: Elodie and Julien. I feverishly searched later editions of the paper, piecing together the grim narrative. Their bodies were never recovered, swallowed by the dark, silt-filled water. The community was devastated. There was a photograph, grainy and faded, of the search party, grim-faced men in skiffs probing the water with long poles. But the most significant discovery was a sidebar article published a week after the tragedy. It was an interview with the captain of the St. Rosalie, a man named Thomas Gallois. He had survived. The article portrayed him as a broken man, consumed by guilt. He spoke of the unnatural speed of the storm, how the sky had turned a bruised greenish black in an instant. He described the boat overturning, the screams, the chaos. He'd lost his grip on Julien's hand in the churning water. He'd tried to find them, he sobbed to the reporter, but they were simply gone. Gallois. The name struck me like a physical blow. Beau Gallois. It was the same family. My mind reeled, the connections snapping into place with terrifying speed. Beau hadn't just been some random old man who ran a tour boat. He was the descendant of the captain responsible for the deaths of that woman and her child. This wasn't a haunting tied to a location. It was a curse tied to a bloodline, a legacy of guilt and spectral retribution. And the boat, the ferry, the St. Rosalie. That had to be the nexus, the ferryman's burden. The captain of the ferry had failed in his duty to deliver his passengers safely. Now the spirits of those he'd failed were eternally bound to his lineage, to his role as a ferryman on that same stretch of water. This horrifying revelation recontextualized everything. Beau hadn't just sold me the Cypress Queen. He had passed me the torch. He had found a loophole, a way to sever himself from the generational curse by tricking an outsider into taking his place. My purchase of the boat wasn't a business transaction. It was an unwitting adoption into a lineage of damnation. I wasn't just being haunted. I was being held accountable for the sins of a man who died a century ago. Armed with this dreadful knowledge, I began to see the rules in a new, horrific light. They weren't defensive measures designed to keep the spirits at bay. Their true purpose was far more sinister. They were a complex, agonizing set of instructions for managing an eternal purgatory. Rule 1. Never kill the main engine after the sun has set. This wasn't to ensure a quick getaway. It was a constant rumbling apology, a vigil. Thomas Galois's steam engine had failed in the storm, silencing the ferry just before it was struck. Keeping the engine running was a symbolic act of readiness, a promise to the spirits that this ferryman would not fail, that he was always prepared to take them where they needed to go, a journey they could never complete. It was a gesture of appeasement. Rule 2. Never answer a voice that calls your name from the banks. This wasn't to avoid being lured to my death. It was to avoid giving them false hope. By answering, by acknowledging their individual calls, I would be engaging with them, making a promise I couldn't keep. The silence was a necessary cruelty, a way to keep them as a collective, indistinct sorrow rather than individual souls making a direct plea for passage. To answer Julian would be to agree to take him aboard. Rule 3. If the boat's lights begin to flicker, return to the dock immediately. The flickering wasn't a threat. It was a sign of their proximity, of their desperation growing too strong. It was their energy interfering with the boat's electrical systems. Returning to the dock was a retreat, a way of de-escalating the situation, of letting their hope and energy subside before it boiled over into something more direct, more physical. It was a tactical withdrawal in a battle that could never be won. Rule 4. Never retrieve what the water offers you. Their gifts, the shell, the toy boat, were offerings, attempts to forge a connection, to create a debt. To accept the gift would be to accept a pact, to agree to their terms. It was an invitation to join their lonely, watery existence. Rule 5. Ignore the toy boat. This was the most personal rule of all. The toy boat was Julian's lure, his specific plea. To engage with it, to show it kindness, would be to single him out, to give him a hope that would inevitably be betrayed, turning his childish sorrow into a focused, potent rage. The entire system was a ghastly balancing act, a ritual of appeasement and denial, designed not to protect the captain from the spirits, but to manage their eternal, agonizing hope. The goal was not to banish them, but to contain their sorrow, to prevent it from escalating. It was a psychological prison, and I had just been handed the keys to my own cell. There was one last piece of the puzzle I found, almost by accident. While packing up the microfiche reels, I found a small follow-up article from several years after the sinking. It was a human interest piece about the lingering grief in the community. It contained a short, cryptic interview with one of the St. Rosalie's few survivors, an old trapper by then, a man who had lost his own brother in the accident. He spoke of the ghosts of the Broussards. The reporter, likely expecting a typical ghost story, asked if the spirits were vengeful. The old man's reply was printed verbatim, and reading it was like having a bucket of ice water thrown over my soul. "Oh no, son," the trapper said, his voice heavy with a lifetime of living beside the tragedy. "They ain't angry, not anymore. They're just lonely. Elodie is still looking for her boy in the dark, and little Julian, he just wants to play. They don't want to hurt nobody. They just want new friends. They want company in the cold forever." The newspaper slipped from my fingers. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about punishment. It was about an insatiable, soul-deep loneliness. They weren't trying to drag me to hell out of anger for Thomas Galois's failure. They were trying to recruit me, to pull me into their cold, timeless stasis, to alleviate their own eternal suffering. To them, my life, my warmth, my companionship was a prize to be won. And Beau, after decades of performing this terrible, draining ritual of appeasement, had finally grown too tired to continue. He must have broken a rule deliberately. He had accepted a gift or answered a call. He had offered himself up as a sacrifice to finally buy his own peace, leaving the ferryman's burden for the next fool who came along. I drove back to the marina in a daze, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery apocalyptic colors. The historical facts and the supernatural horror had merged into one cohesive, suffocating truth. My personal haunting was just the latest chapter in a century-old tragedy. As I stood on the dock staring at the placid, dark surface of the water, I felt a profound shift within myself. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in my gut. But the anger and the desperation had coalesced into something else, a grim, terrible resolve. I understood the game now. I knew the rules and the stakes. The question that remained was whether I was strong enough to play it for the rest of my life, or if, like Bo, I would eventually grow too tired, too lonely, and answer the call. The locket felt heavy in my pocket, a constant reminder of the souls tethered to my fate. I was no longer just Leo, the tourboat captain. I was the ferryman, and my passengers were waiting. Before I tell you what happened when I went back out onto the water that night, I want you to do something for me. Pause for a moment. Put yourself in my shoes, standing on that dark dock with a century-old locket in your pocket and the voice of your dead wife echoing in your ears. You finally understand the history, the names of your ghosts, the reason for your torment. You know the rules are a lie, or at least not the truth you thought they were. What do? Do you sell the boat and run, hoping the curse doesn't follow? Do you confess everything, ensuring your own commitment to a psychiatric ward? Or do you do what I did? Do you hold on to that one desperate sliver of hope that there is a way to end it? That you can confront the source, satisfy the sorrow, and sever the chain that Beau Gallois so cruelly shackled to you? Think about it, and then leave me a comment below telling me what you think the terrible final truth of the ferryman's burden really is. Because I promise you, whatever you're imagining, the reality is so much worse. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. You'll want to be here when the next story surfaces. My decision was not born of courage, it was born of exhaustion. I could not live the rest of my life as a prisoner to these rituals of appeasement, forever managing the grief of insatiable ghosts. I couldn't endure another night of hearing Anna's voice twisted into a spectral lure. My sanity was already a frayed rope, and it was about to snap. I had to try something. The locket was the key. It was Elodie and Julian's last connection to the living world, the object Beau had hidden away as the burden. My flawed, desperate logic concluded that returning it to them, bringing it to the site of their demise, might be an act of peace, a final rite of passage that Thomas Gallois had failed to provide. I convinced myself it was a gesture of compassion, but deep down I knew it was an act of pure, selfish desperation. I wanted my life back. I waited until well after midnight, when the town was asleep and the marina was a ghost town of silent, bobbing masts. I didn't turn on the dock lights. I worked in the oppressive darkness, my only illumination the thin beam of my flashlight. The Cypress Queen felt different tonight, not menacing, but expectant. The air inside the cabin was cold and still. As I started the engine, its familiar cough and rumble sounded unnaturally loud in the profound silence. I kept it at an idle rule number 1, a deeply ingrained habit, a prayer I couldn't stop reciting, even though I no longer understood its meaning. Navigating the bayou in the pitch black is an act of faith. You pilot by memory, by the feel of the current, by the silhouettes of ancient cypress trees against a sky that is only a shade less black than the water itself. Tonight, however, it felt as though the swamp was guiding me. The channels seemed to open up before me, the turns less treacherous. The usual night sounds, the croaking of frogs, the chorus of insects, the splash of a fish, were gone. There was only the low thrum of my engine, and a silence so complete, so absolute, that it felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting. I was not traveling through a familiar ecosystem. I was moving through a vast, silent cathedral of dread. I knew when I'd arrived at the spot. The archives had given me the approximate coordinates of the St. Rosalie's sinking, but I didn't need a map. I felt it. The temperature plummeted, the humid Louisiana air turning sharp and cold, biting at my exposed skin. A thick, unnatural fog began to rise from the water, swirling around the hull of the Cypress Queen, isolating me in a small, white bubble of existence. The engine's idle seemed to falter, the sound becoming strained as if the cold was thickening the oil in its crankcase. I cut the throttle, letting the boat drift to a stop in the center of the spectral mist. I took the silver locket from my pocket. It was ice cold, a circle of absolute zero in my trembling palm. "Elodie," I called out, my voice a pathetic crack in the immense silence. "Julian, I'm here." For a moment, nothing happened. There was only the fog, the cold, and the labored breathing of my own lungs. Then the whispers started, not from one direction, but from everywhere at once. They were the voices of a crowd, a chorus of the lost, swirling around me in the mist. I could hear fragments of French, snippets of conversations, a woman humming a lullaby, a man cursing the sudden storm. It was the ambient sound of the St. Rosalie's final moments, replaying on an eternal loop. Then the lights appeared, dozens of them. Small, pale globes of phosphorescence, the infamous feux follets igniting in the fog. They danced and swayed over the black water, bobbing like spectral buoys, marking the graves of the drowned. The boat's own lights began to flicker erratically, just as Beau's journal had described, casting the scene in a frantic, strobe-lit horror. Through the swirling lights and mist, they began to take form. On the water's surface, just off the port bow, the figures of a woman and a child coalesced from the fog. They were translucent, their forms shimmering, woven from mist and moonlight. Elodie was tall and slender, her long dress appearing heavy with water, her face a mask of serene, eternal sorrow. Her hand was held out, but not for me. She was reaching for the small figure beside her. Julian. He looked exactly as he had in the Locketts' photograph, a small, solemn boy in a sailor suit. He wasn't looking at his mother, he was looking directly at me, and there was no anger in his eyes, only a profound, bottomless, and terrifyingly patient longing. My heart was a wild drum against my ribs, but my desperate plan propelled me forward. I held up the locket so they could see it, the silver catching the ghostly light. "I know who you are," I said, my voice shaking. "This belongs to you. I'm returning it. Thomas Gallois, Beau, they couldn't help you. But I'm here now. Take this. And please, be at peace." I extended my hand over the side of the boat, the locket resting on my open palm. I was offering them a conclusion, a finality. I was trying to close the book on their story, but they didn't move towards the locket. They didn't even look at it. Julian's sad, lonely eyes remained fixed on my face. And Elodie's sorrowful gaze lifted from her son and drifted past me. She wasn't looking at me, the new ferryman. She was looking through me, beyond me, back in the direction of the distant shore, where the lights of the town were a faint, hazy glow. She was waiting, but not for me. And in that one shattering moment of misdirection, the final hideous truth crashed down upon me. The full, unutterable weight of the ferryman's burden settled into my soul, and I finally understood. I had been so arrogant in my fear, so self-centered in my terror. I thought this was about me. I thought I was the target, the victim of a generational curse. I thought the rules were a shield to protect the captain. I had been catastrophically, idiotically wrong. The rules were never meant to protect me. They were meant to protect the tourists. My job, the true nature of the curse I had inherited, was not to be haunted. It was to be a zookeeper, a warden, a shepherd. The spirits of the St. Rosalie were not bound to the Gallois bloodline out of vengeance. They were bound to the role of the ferryman, and they were insatiably, eternally lonely. Their whispers, their flickering lights, their appearances, those were not attacks on me. They were pleas. They were the desperate rattling of prison bars. My purpose was not to survive them. My purpose was to feed them. Not with my life, not with my soul, but with a steady, tantalizing stream of living energy. I was meant to bring boatloads of warm, vibrant, laughing people, families, lovers, children, out onto their water day after day. I was to parade this feast of life just before their hungry, sorrowful eyes, allowing them to bask in the periphery of its warmth, to feed on the emotional energy, to momentarily alleviate their crushing solitude. But the rules, the terrible, terrible rules, were the crux of the torture. I was to bring the flock to the wolves, but I was never, ever allowed to let them have one. Never answer the voice, so you don't single one out for consumption. Never stop the engine, so you're never a sitting target. Never accept a gift, so you don't finalize a pact of sacrifice. The entire system was designed to create a state of perpetual, agonizing proximity. My job was to offer them a constant, fleeting hope, and then snatch it away every single day for the rest of my life. My survival was contingent on my complicity in their torture. Beau hadn't fled a haunting. He had abdicated a monstrous responsibility. He hadn't offered himself up to them. He had simply quit his post, leaving the gate open for the next unsuspecting warden to wander in. The realization did not come with a scream. It came with a profound, internal silence. The ghosts of Elodie and Julien began to fade, their forms dissolving back into the swirling fog. They had shown me what I needed to see. The lesson was over. The locket was still in my hand, now feeling impossibly heavy, a badge of my horrific office. I piloted the Cypress Queen back to the marina. There was no frantic rush this time, no panicked flight. I moved with the slow, dead certainty of a man walking to his own gallows. The fear was gone, burned away, and replaced by something far colder. A hollow, endless despair. I was not a victim. I was a tool, an essential component in a century-old machine of sorrow. I now understand my life. I will run my tours. I will tell my practiced jokes. I will point out the egrets and the alligators. I will smile at the children who wave at me from the deck, and every afternoon I will take them out over that deep, dark water. I will feel the cold spot as we pass over the wreck of the St. Rosalie. I will hear the whispers that my passengers will mistake for the wind, and I will see the faint, hungry shimmer of the feu follet that they will dismiss as swamp gas, and I will follow the rules. I will keep the engine running. I will ignore the voices, and I will bring everyone back to the dock safe and sound, leaving the lonely souls in the water with nothing but the fading memory of warmth. I will survive. My body will live, but my hope, my sanity, my soul, they are lost forever. They belong to the bayou now. I am the ferryman. And this is not a haunting. This is a job.